Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. Last week I started a mini-series where I'm making elemental Space Marines. This video is part 2, and in this one we're going to be making a Space Marine that represents the element of fire. If you haven't seen part 1 but you do enjoy this video, then I definitely recommend going back and watching that one after this one. To get started on the Fire Space Marine, I decided to grab up some of my sprues and kits that I've got and have a look at the pieces that I might need. In terms of what I have at my disposal, I only have one pack of 10 intercessors, a couple of sprues that make 5 assault intercessors, and then a couple of sprues that I'm borrowing from a relative that have a few bits and bobs from different things like breachers and other Space Marines like Reavers. Part of the challenge of this series is not to go and buy loads of different parts and spend a fortune on bits just to make the perfect Marine. Though you could totally do that if you wanted to. It would probably make them look even better than what I can make here. To get started with my Space Marine representing fire, I decided to try and learn how to sculpt fire, and a few other little bits that were ideas I had going into this build. It turns out fire is extremely tricky to sculpt, and so I really struggled with this and didn't in the end up using any of my epoxy, but I wanted to show that I gave it a go and that it will take me a lot longer than a single week to learn how to sculpt something like fire. And while I mess around with the epoxy sculpt, let me talk a little bit about my ideas for the Fire Marine. For the Earth Space Marine, it was all about the job. It was about him going down into caves and fighting Votann and Necrons. So I want to keep a similar theme for this fire guy. I want it to be all about his job. This guy is a pyromaniac and he goes out and he sets fire to everything. That's his job. One of the pieces I started with was an axe from my Chaos Space Marine Kill Team box. You can see some of my Chaos Space Marines from my Kill Team on my Instagram if you're interested. There's a few of them on there. And I began to just add epoxy into the gaps. I wanted to flatten the gaps, and then my idea was I was going to sand it flat so I had a nice flat axe that didn't look too chaosy for this Space Marine. Fire was always going to be a little bit tricky amongst the 4 of these elements, just for the simple reason that there are already quite a few fiery Space Marine chapters. The Salamanders chapter has a lot of fiery elements to it already, and the Legion of the Damned are a really fiery chapter. I didn't want to do something supernatural, and I didn't want to do something that was just Salamanders, so I need this guy to be distinct. So I specifically wasn't going to use any Salamander parts to make this easier. This guy has to be his own type of fire. And hopefully you'll see at the end that he comes out completely different, with his own visual style that doesn't look anything like the other stuff I mentioned. So now going back to the parts, I've now attached the axe that's been sanded onto an arm that I found, and it was very easy to just cut the little notch off the end of the arm to make it flat so I could stick the hand on. And I used a little bit of green stuff to just help join the gap. And on the screen is a little mock-up using blue tack just to put the pieces where I roughly think the arm should go. Then I played around with a shoulder pad, and I had the idea to sculpt fire onto it, but as I couldn't sculpt fire very successfully, I had to think of something else, so I thought about grenades. This guy who loves fire, he'd be all about firepower, and I thought, why don't I just load his shoulder up with grenades? It will give it a bit of a different shape, it will look really cool. So I found an arrangement that I like, and I glued everything into place. At the beginning of the video, I was playing around with epoxy, and I was trying to make discs that I was going to put on the power pack. In the end, I decided to cut little discs out of plasticard. Plasticard is something I picked up after doing the bases video. I knew it would be way more helpful than the grey board I used in that. And this plasticard, I had to cut out 2 circles, which was really hard because I couldn't cut perfect circles. Luckily, my dad had a punch that you can use with a hammer, so I used that to get the circles. But if you were doing this, you could 3D print discs, or you could cut squares because that's easier. Then I looked at head options, and I decided I wouldn't know how to make a normal Space Marine helmet fiery, so I decided to just pick a really cool helmet. So I picked one that had what looked like gas canistery bits on the side of the head, and like a laser and a torch for seeing through smoke, and a cool visor. Similar to the first video with the Earth Elemental, I wanted to lay out all the pieces to see where I was at and to help me plan how I was going to glue things together. At this point, I pretty much knew that I was going to have a flamethrower hand and an axe hand, and then I've got my shoulder with my grenades and my normal shoulder that I'm going to draw a symbol on, and then I've got backpack and head and a few other little bits like grenades that I could stick around. But I was missing actual fire, so luckily my dad had a plan. We ended up burning sprues outside in the garage until we had some misformed shapes like this that looked like fire. This is fire on a budget. Twisting the sprues and pulling them gave me these twisted, flamey shapes that I could use. But I just have to quickly say, if you're going to do this, be careful with fire and probably wear a respirator or do this outside because it could produce nasty fumes. These spare parts from my Votann kill team came in handy, and I decided to cut the little grenade-looking things off the bottom, these canisters, because I had an idea I wanted to roll with, and you'll see that later. And one part that you'll see here in the lineup is some form of oxygen tank. Didn't end up using those oxygen tanks, but I will end up using a tank of some kind. And then it was time for gluing. So I started with the fire axe arm, and I used blue tack to test a couple of bits just before I glued them together. So with the new fiery pieces I created out of sprue, I used a bit of blue tack just to see what they would look like on the top of the power pack. I was happy with that though, so I then glued them and stuck them into place. And I think considering they're just random pieces of sprue, once I'd cleaned them up with some clipping, they actually ended up looking quite a lot like fire. I was quite surprised, actually. Then I glued on the flamethrower arm, and I went for a one-handed flamethrower because I didn't want to obscure any details in the middle of the model. And then I glued to the shoulder a pair of rather large dangling grenades. And I think I got those from my Crew Kill Team sprue. Just so that no one can say I didn't try it, this is what the fire shoulder pad would have looked like. I would have probably used some Milliput to smooth it all out. And it may have looked cool, I don't know, but the grenades look really cool, so no regrets. And this is where I added in those extra Votan canisters that I cut off the guns. I added one to the back and the front of the grenades, which created this really cool row of cylinders to bulk out the shoulder. I glued each shoulder pad on in turn, starting with the plain one and then the grenade one. And things were really starting to take shape. I spun the miniature around, and on the back, I stuck in a little oxygen tank from a Navy breacher. For some crazy reason, I wanted the fire on the power pack to seem realistic. I mean, nothing else seems realistic, but I just wanted it to. So I thought there needs to be a fuel source for these fires to run, so I'll stick an oxygen tank on the back, and then I'll find a way to link it up in a minute. I was thinking about things I could stick around his belt, and I was thinking about grenades or fire canisters. I thought, wouldn't it be good to have a few more fire canisters for him to put in the flamethrower? And I thought, well, actually, why don't I just give him another flamethrower then? So this maniac of a Marine is running around with 2 flamethrowers for when the first one runs out, he can just pick up another one. Perfect. I loved it. I grabbed a paperclip and I cut the paperclip with some snippers, and then I basically got a small shape where I curved the top, and I thought I can stick this into place on the power pack and it will make the oxygen tank look like it's fueling the fires on the power pack, which it does. So I think that's cool. And then for the base, I initially thought, well, I've got to put him on a lava base, right? That's what a fire guy would be. But I had to think about that job that I mentioned earlier. He's a pyromaniac, he sets fire to everything, and you would not set fire to everything in a place where everything is already on fire, like in a volcano. So instead, I thought, this guy has got to be in some kind of infested, horrible alien Xenos planet location, or some kind of outpost or something that's been overrun with all of this nasty organic horribleness. So I did something that I've done before in a few other videos, where I just started sticking cork to the base to create different levels. And I knew I had to have a level for his feet, so I planned the piece around his feet and cut it with clippers, and then I glued on a second little piece. This is going to be for that Tyranid/Gene Stealer head that I had earlier, and so that it can be raised to the same height so that it will fit in the axe. Then I used Milliput to roll a thin sausage, and I used that to create these weird tendrils that I wanted to come out of the ground. It's a bit wild and out there, so use your imagination, and it was my first time ever trying to make anything like this. So set your expectations accordingly. You can't do an infested alien planet without some eggs, so I built up a little mound, and then I rolled out some slightly cylindrical spheres and stuck them on as eggs. To finish the base off, I covered everything in a muddy texture paste, and then I began to glue everything together. And with everything primed and ready for painting, this is what I had. It's amazing how much a coat of primer can bring everything together. Now that you can't see all the different colours of the pieces, everything looks like it's supposed to be there. So now I have to make sure I paint it as good as I built it. So I mentioned in the first video that I wanted to do a similar thing with the colours, where I do a darker colour in the middle on the chest, shoulders and head, and then I do a lighter colour on the extremities like the legs and arms. So that's exactly what I did. I took a dark red, I took corn red from Citadel, and I added it all over the shoulders and upper body. Corn red applies really well and is a really good paint, I think, and even over this dark black base coat, it only took 2 coats to get it opaque. While I paint the red in, I just want to say a massive thanks for all the support on the first video and the short for the Earth Elemental. The short's done really well, and the channel has grown massively since last week. And it's awesome that I get to share this creative and fun stuff that I'm doing here in my hobby with a lot more people. So then after all the red, it was time to decide how I was going to paint the extremities, and I was going to go with a lighter colour similar to the Earth guy. So I toyed around with a bunch of different oranges and in the end decided to go with Jaquero orange from Citadel. And once I painted that in, I did a second base coat to get a solid layer of colour and it looked like this. Painting the armour was largely a very similar process to the last video. So next I worked on some shading for the armour and I did some recess panel shading on the legs with a slightly darker orangey brown. And then I tested out my highlights to make sure I liked them. And when I was happy with the highlights, I decided to crack on and start doing it all over the model. So first I continued the recess shading all over the place. To get this shadow colour, I mixed my Jaquero orange with Rhinox hide, and then to bring back a bit of the orange, I added a tiny bit of Chimera orange into the mix, because it's a bit of a darker orange. And then with the recess shading done on the legs and the arms, I went and did some highlighting on the chest. To highlight the corn red, I just used Evil Sun's Scarlet, as it's a much brighter red and will create a nice jump in saturation and brightness. For the highlight on the Jaquero orange parts, which are the legs and the arms, I decided to just add ice yellow to that. And then I applied neat edge highlights all around the armor panels. And admittedly, I wasn't quite as neat as I was with my Titus video. That one I tried really hard to get neatness. And this one, I still tried to make it neat, but I wasn't worried too much if it wasn't perfect because the overall paint job would still make everything look really cool. I'm going to show a clip just to show where we're at this point on the paint job. So you can see with everything edge highlighted up here, this is what we have so far. A lot of people mentioned Bionicle in my first short, and I swear I didn't mean to, but I looked up the Fire Bionicle and he just happens to be the same colours. But I don't mind because Bionicle is really cool and it brings back memories of my childhood and watching the Bionicle movies. I did a really quick highlight of Scrag Brown on the Rhinox hide that I'd used for the belt. And then I mixed up a quick brown-grey colour. I think I just added black to some of the oranges that were on my wet palette and decided to paint the handle of the axe with that. The black parts of this miniature are still covered in primer, but I thought actually the black looks really cool here, and black is a colour that's associated with fire because of smoke being black. So I just thought actually I should leave some of these parts black because it looks really cool. So I started to add a black over these areas and then I started to highlight them with grey. So I used charcoal from Vallejo for the first highlight. And then for the second round of highlights that I did after that, I used Eshin Grey from Citadel because it's slightly lighter. Using these deep dark greys for highlights would keep this area reading as black and make sure that I didn't over highlight with light greys, which would have made these parts look more grey than actual black. And with those parts highlighted, that's the three main parts of the model highlighted at this point. And I think I somehow stumbled on a really nice paint scheme. It was time for me to start thinking about the fiery places, so I had to do a big base coat of white all over everywhere that I thought would be fiery. It's just easier to paint a white base coat over the black areas before I start adding yellows and oranges to those areas, rather than trying to add them directly over the black. The Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White is one of the better whites I've found for adding base coats over dark colours, so I'd recommend getting that if you don't have it and you want a slightly easier time painting white. Although it's never going to be super easy, white is just pretty much always a bit of a pain. And with the areas all painted white, it looked like this. And then before I actually got to painting any of the fire, I decided to paint the skin tones with those three paints you just saw on the screen. It's a super easy recipe and I find it generally works for small faces like this. I cover the whole skin surface in Bugsman Glow and then I basically cover 95% of that with Cadian Flesh Tone, and then I come in and I cover maybe about 40% of the Cadian Flesh Tone with some highlights of the Kislev Flesh. And at this point I decided I should dot the eyes before I do the final highlight. I would normally say that it's some kind of crazy sorcery that anyone can paint eyes this small. However, I kind of did it this time. I'll admit I think I got super lucky, but everything just seemed to work and I even did it first time. So I added the white dots and they worked out, and then I added tiny little black dots to the middle of the eyes and somehow the paint just rolled off the brush perfectly. I must have had the perfect consistency and I got eyes that look like this. Now he looks a little bit crazy, but I thought for a pyromaniac that's absolutely fine, so we'll go with it. And then to finish up the face, I added that last highlight of Kislev Flesh, just mainly over the brow and the top of the forehead. A little bit around the eyes and on the bridge of the nose as well. And here's a quick look at the top of the head, just to show you what I did with that. Brighter colour on the top, darker colour on the sides. I had only done one highlight on the armour at this point, so I wanted to do a second highlight to bring the contrast up more. So I grabbed a bit of Tau Light Ochre and I mixed that into the Khorne Red to get a much brighter highlight colour. I learnt the tip that Tau Light Ochre is a really good highlight colour for red off of the Evi Archive website. It's a great resource if you want to go use it. But little tips like that are really handy, and knowing that Tau Light Ochre can be a really good highlight for red can help you really push your reds into a warm yellowy highlight area. Personally, I'm just not much of a fan of the pinkyish red highlights. I much prefer orangey warm red highlights. My second highlight on the lighter orange parts was just more ice yellow added into the mix, and then I went round and meticulously added my second highlight, trying to be a little bit smaller than the first layer of highlight. And after that, I decided to paint all the metals. This time, I tried using a different kind of metallic paint. I used dark steel from the Vallejo Mecha Color range instead. I just wanted to try out what it was like and see what it looked like. And I think it applied well, and I did quite like it, so I would use it again. Flamethrowers in the 40k universe always have a kind of brassy, bronzy type look to them on the bit that shoots fire, and so I wanted to do that here as well. I initially used bronze from ProAcryl's metal range, and then I used copper from ProAcryl's metal range to highlight it, and I added a bit of silver to the copper to do a final edge highlight around some of the edges. Following that, I decided to slap a wash of Nuln Oil all over the metals. Everybody does this, it's just a great way to create definition. For the highlights on the silver metal parts, I just added some ProAcryl silver to the dark steel from Mecha Color and used that as my highlight. Now that the metals are highlighted, it's time to do some fun details. And the first of those is his visor. So I grabbed some fluorescent orange. I grabbed luminous fluorescent orange, I think from AK 3rd Gen, and I just applied that into the visor. The visor is not meant to be fire, it's just supposed to be painted orange to match the fiery vibe. He's not burning his eyeballs every time he pulls his visor down. Then it was time to teach myself how to paint fire, because I haven't really done it much yet. I did it a little bit on a Marvel United model, but I don't have a lot of practice, so I just tried to start putting down colours and see how it goes. I base coated every area in ice yellow towards the base, where the fire would be most intense, and then I used Scarlet Blood from Vallejo to add a red to all the areas where it would be further away from the centre of the fire. The idea was to then meet them in the middle with an orange, so I used Lava Orange from Vallejo to try and meet in the middle, and that kind of didn't work. So what I ended up doing in the end was taking the Hexad set of orangey colours from the Army Painter range, the Fanatic range, and I used all of those colours basically from here on to just paint all the fiery parts. This set of 6 colours seems to be tailor-made for painting fire. So I worked from the brightest colour, which is called Inner Light, at the base of my fires where they're most intense, to the reddyish molten lava all the way at the top of the Hexad as the darkest colour. I made sure to add some orangey glow to those weird Votan devices I added to the shoulder pads later. I felt like that just gave it more of a fiery appearance. If you just had the fire on the backpack and then the fire on the axe, there'd have been nothing to meet in the middle. So that little bit of fire on the shoulder just gives him that one more fiery element to him to make him the Fire Space Marine. I spent quite a long time just blending the colours, working in different levels of orange and yellow, until I was finally happy with the flames and how they looked. I had to make sure I also painted the top of the discs under the flames an orangey colour. I didn't want to paint them the brightest of yellowy oranges. I wanted to paint them more of mid oranges, because those areas would obviously be so close to the fire they'd be almost completely illuminated as well. I've skipped over the axe a bit because I'm going to change it later on, and so I jumped to some details and I jumped to paint his little lens for his little smoke visual detector thing and his torch, which will help him also see in dark smoky areas. Or at least that's what they are in my made up lore for this guy. Then I did a quick highlight with a brighter colour of this brown grey that I've got for the handle. I just added ice yellow to the previous base coat. Now it's time to have a go at an effect, and I was going to try and do muzzle burn on the flamethrower. I looked up some references and it seems to go yellow, brown, purple and blue. So I grabbed the corresponding inks and I got to work. I applied yellow and then I applied purple, and I just thought inks would help me stain the metallics more here, so that's why I chose inks. And then finally, on the very tip, I applied the blue. And all things considered, I actually think this turned out quite good for this effect. So yeah, if you want to use that for your effect, go for it. Here's a close-up look when the inks were dry. I'm going to leave a couple of elements like the fire axe off camera so that when I do the final reveal, there's a couple of little things that you haven't seen before. And so the last part of this video will be all about the base. And if I had to describe this base in one word, it would be purple. Very purple. I took the weird strand things I sculpted, the weird tentacles, and I decided to cover those in Ushabti bone. And then I ended up mixing Ushabti bone with a bunch of magenta paint and trying to do a shade wash over those. Didn't go fully to plan. I ended up just staining them mostly magenta, which is fine. I went with it. Then I painted up the eggs, more with a magenta color than a purple color here, just for them to stand out against the mud more. One of the actual eggs is supposed to be destroyed. I don't know if you can catch that in the clips, but it's like a destroyed egg. So that one has just got an edge highlight around the edge, but it's kind of like it's been stomped on or hit by a bullet or something. I applied a coat of Ushabti bone, just pure Ushabti bone, to the Gene Stealer head, and then I worked on that a little bit more off camera. I decided to do some final details around the miniature, like these green grenades up on his shoulder pads, and the straps underneath those grenades as well. And then I realized I'd forgotten to do an edge highlight on the back of the model for the red, so I used that Tau Light Ochre mix I mentioned earlier to just go and do that highlight as neatly as I could. With all of that finished and the extra work on the axe done and some of the base, it's time to do a final reveal. So here he is, Elemental Marine number 2, representing fire. And you'll see some details here, like the shoulder pad there with the white flame symbol. I also painted his tube on his backpack red. I've changed the axe so that the core of the axe is now more in the whole center of the axe rather than just by the handle. So that's a bit of a different look for the axe. I just thought that looked slightly better overall. You can see there's a lot more purple on the base now, and I did a bit of Ushabti highlighting. And you can also see that on that poor Gene Stealer's head, there's a big fiery cut where the axe is sort of going into it or just coming out of it. This one has turned out pretty cool, but I'm not sure which one I'm doing next, whether it's air or water, so I'll leave that as a mystery. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.